Introduction to Gender Studies. Today, we are defining gender, sex, sexuality, and other key concepts like patriarchy, feminism, masculinity, femininity, and gender roles. The categories of gender, sex, and sexuality have been central to scholarly debates across the humanities and social sciences, shaping how societies organize power, identity, and cultural practices. These terms often overlap in public discourse, yet each carries distinct conceptual and analytical weight. Sex refers to the biological and physiological differences in male and female bodies, including chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive anatomy, while gender, in contrast, is a social and cultural construct encompassing expectations, roles, and performances associated with masculinity and femininity. Sexuality refers to desires, orientations, and practices that govern intimate relationships and erotic attachments. These distinctions, though widely accepted in contemporary academic discourse, remains contested. Historically, societies collapsed sex, gender, and sexuality into a single existential framework assuming biological determinism. Feminism, queer, and post-structuralist theories, however, emphasize that societies perceive as natural often reflects cultural, political, and economic power arrangements. The emergence of key concepts such as patriarchy, feminism, masculinity, and gender roles have provided tools for critically interrogating these assumptions. This defines and explores sex, gender, and sexuality as distinct yet interconnected categories. We also examine the aforementioned key concepts, tracing their historical development, theoretical foundations, and their contemporary relevance. The discussion also centers around questions of identity, justice, power, highlighting how gendered ideologies shape institutions and individual lives across different cultural contexts. Defining sex has traditionally been understood in biological terms, referring to physiological characters such as chromosomes XX for female, XY for male, reproductive organs, and secondary sexual traits like voice pitch and bodily hair. The biomedical sciences in the 19th century reinforced binary categories of male and female, presenting them as universal and unchanging. Yet, as contemporary scholarship shows, this binary is more complicated. Medical and anthropological studies of intersex variations, conditions in which individuals are born with chromosomal, hormonal, or anatomical differences that do not fit typical definitions of male or female, challenge existential definitions of sex. For example, Annie Frosto-Sterling argues that nature itself produces a spectrum rather than a dichotomy of that rigid categorization, which often reflects social anxieties rather than biological truth. In parallel, Judith Lober also contends that sex categories are not merely biological facts but socially organized classifications that carry institutional consequences. In this sense, sex is not simply a biologically given but an interaction between biology and cultural interpretation. Modern debates about sports eligibility, medical treatment, and legal recognition of intersex individuals show how biology becomes entangled with questions of identity, fairness, and human rights. A clear distinction must therefore be maintained between what is biological and how it has given meaning to gender, while acknowledging that the division itself is mediated by culture. Defining gender, unlike sex, refers to social and cultural constructions of what it means to be masculine or feminine. Simone de Beauvoir, in her book Second Sex, clearly tells one is not born but rather becomes a woman. This captures the idea that gender is acquired through socialization rather than dictated by biology. From early childhood, individuals internalize expectations about dress, behavior, career aspirations, and even emotional expression based on gendered norms. Theories of gender emphasize performance and relationality. Judith Butler, another important scholar, in her Gender Trouble book, argues that gender is not a fixed identity but a set of repeated acts, gestures, and performances that produce the illusion of naturalness. This performative theory of Butler suggests that gender is not something one has but rather something one does. This is continuously reinforced through cultural repetition. Cultural variation also demonstrates the social constructedness of gender. In some indigenous North American traditions, the two-spirit identity encompasses roles outside the Western male-female binary, while in South Asia, Hijra communities historically they occupy distinct social positions. These examples underscore that gender roles are having cultural and historical context as well. From a gender studies lens, the field explores how gender permeates our everyday lives, how we communicate, how institutions regulates bodies and behaviors. Gender studies challenges this binary framework which interrogates how man and women are produced and regulated via power structure. As one foundational text states, gender is socially constructed through expectations, behaviors, and attributes that a society considers appropriate for men and women. Defining sexuality. Sexuality refers to sexual desires, practices, and orientations. Michael Foucault, in his book History of Sexuality, revolutionized the understandings of sexuality by showing that it is not merely a biological instinct but a social discourse which was shaped by the institutions of power. For Foucault, sexuality became central to modern governance, with states, medical institutions, and religious authorities regulating bodies and behaviors. Contemporary frameworks recognize sexuality as multidimensional. Sexual orientation encompasses heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, asexuality, pansexuality, among others. Importantly, sexuality intersects with gender, race, class, and religion. For instance, Adrienne Ritz's concept of compulsory heterosexuality critiques how societies institutionalize heterosexuality as a default norm, thereby marginalizing queer identities. Likewise, queer theory challenges rigid categorizations of sexuality, arguing that identities are fluid and resistant to binary logics. Eva Kosofsky-Sedgwick, in her Epistemology of the Closet, highlights how the categories of homo and hetero have structured Western thought, revealing the instability of sexual identities. To summarize, sexuality is not simply who you are attracted to, but is embedded in historical, cultural, and institutional formations of desire, identity, and power. Now let's come to the key concept, patriarchy. Patriarchy refers to a system of male dominance in which men hold power in the political, economic, cultural, and familial spheres. This term is originated from Greek patriarchos, means the rule of the father, and historically it denotes men have the authority within the kinship systems. Feminist theorists in the 20th century expanded this term to encompass structural inequalities that extend beyond the family. Sylvia Walby, in her book Theorizing Patriarchy, identifies 6 structures of patriarchy: household production, paid work, the state, male violence, sexuality, and cultural institutions. These intersect to sustain male privilege and female subordination. Patriarchy functions both overtly through legal discrimination and gender-based violence, and covertly through cultural norms that naturalize women's secondary status. Critics of patriarchy emphasize its adaptability as well. In capitalist societies, for instance, patriarchy intersects with class exploitation, while in post-colonial contexts it intersects with cultural nationalism. Intersectional feminists such as bell hooks argue that patriarchy cannot be understood in isolation but must be analyzed in relation to race, class and sexuality. Patriarchy then is less a monolithic system and more a complex matrix of power relations that manifest through gendered social organization. In gender studies, patriarchy is central because it helps to explain and understand how gendered privilege and disadvantage are structurally reproduced. It asks who holds power, how it is maintained, and how it can be challenged. Feminism. Feminism can be understood both as a theoretical framework and a political movement aimed at dismantling gender inequalities and advocating for women's rights. This is often portrayed as monolithic, but feminism encompasses diverse perspectives and waves. First wave feminism, which focused on legal rights, especially suffrage. Second wave feminism, which emphasized on reproductive rights. Third wave feminism, which incorporated concepts such as intersectionality, which talked on how race, class, sexuality and disability shaped women's experiences. Fourth wave feminism, which employed digital platforms to address sexual harassment. Me Too movement, body positivity and gender justice, which was brought on a global scale. Theoretical strands within feminism include liberal feminism, radical feminism, and postmodern feminism. Intersectional feminism, which was pioneered by Kimberly Crenshaw, emphasizes on overlapping systems of oppression, which remains highly influential in contemporary gender studies. Feminism provides the analytical lens to interrogate gender, sex, and sexuality not only as lived individual phenomena but as a structural and cultural process. It invites us to ask, how are gendered expectations produced? Who benefits from this? Who is left out? What forms of resistance exist? Masculinity. Masculinity refers to socially constructed attributes, behaviors, and roles associated with men. The term masculinity might evoke a single dominant model. Gender scholars emphasizes plurality. A. Connell concept of hegemonic masculinity describes culturally dominant form of masculinity that legitimizes male power. According to Connell, hegemonic masculinity holds normative status. It is not necessarily the most numerically common form of being a man, but most socially endorsed. Subordinate masculinities, marginalized masculinities, and complicit masculinities reveal the complex hierarchy among men themselves. Cultural expectations of masculinity often emphasize strength, rationality, authority, and emotional restraint. These ideals are reinforced by socialization and other institutions. For example, the reluctance among men to seek mental health support is linked to normative expectations of stoicism and invulnerability. The concept of masculinity thus becomes a site of both power and restriction. Masculinity studies highlight that men too are shaped, just like women, by gendered systems, not only in relation to women but also in relation to the situation of ideal manhood. Understanding masculinity is therefore essential to understanding gender as a whole. Femininity refers to traits, behaviors, and roles culturally associated with women. Traditionally, femininity emphasizes nurturance, emotionality, passivity, and beauty. Yet, as with masculinity, femininity is neither universal nor static. Cognell distinguishes emphasized femininity as a cultural dominant form of femininity oriented towards accommodating male interests and desires. Alternative femininities, resistant, assertive, or queer, challenge these norms. Feminist scholars argue that femininity is both a site of subordination and a potential resource for empowerment. For instance, cultural reclamation of traits like empathy and collaboration as leadership qualities challenges the devaluation of feminine coded behaviors. At the same time, body positive movements contest narrow standards of beauty that constrain women's autonomy. In gender studies, femininity is not simply what women are, but a structure of meaning that regulates bodies and behaviors. It is a lens for examining how womanhood is totally constructed, policed and transformed. Gender roles. Gender roles are prescribed behaviors, tasks and responsibilities expected of individuals based on their perceived sex. These roles are institutionalized through family, education, religion, media and law. For instance, men are often associated with breadwinning and authority, while women are linked to caregiving and domestic labor. Sociological research shows gender roles are learned early in life via socialization. Toys, clothing, media reinforce stereotypes that shape aspirations and opportunities. Gender roles often function to maintain gendered power relations by allocating men and women to distinct domains and tasks, thus reproducing both difference and hierarchy. Feminist and queer movements challenge the rigidity of gender roles, pointing to the increasing fluidity of roles. Women working in paid labor, men taking caregiving responsibilities, recognition of non-binary identities. Yet, resistance to changing gender roles often manifests in backlash, as seen in debates over family values, workplace equality and LGBTQ+ rights. Gender roles therefore remain a central location of contestation in contemporary societies. Intersections and contemporary relevance of these concepts. All these concepts like sex, gender, sexuality, patriarchy, feminism, masculinity, femininity and gender roles can be explored individually, and their strength lies in examining their intersections. Gender, sex and sexuality intersect with broader axes of power including race, class, religion and nationality. Intersectionality reveals how systems of oppression overlap. For instance, women of color experience sexism differently from white women, shaped by racial discrimination and structural inequalities, as mentioned by Crenshaw. Globalization and technology have further transformed gender debates. Digital platforms amplify feminist activism, while transnational migration and cultural exchange expose to diverse gender systems. At the same time, conservative or reactionary movements resist changes, often invoking traditional gender roles as anchors of cultural identity. Contemporary issues such as debates over transgender rights, same-sex marriage, reproductive justice and workplace equality highlight the ongoing relevance of these concepts. They demonstrate that gender, sex and sexuality are not merely academic categories but lived realities that shape justice, health and democracy. For example, the field of male mental health examines how hegemonic masculinity constrains emotional expression and health-seeking behavior, while feminist political economy interrogates how unpaid domestic labor shaped by traditional femininity and gender roles undervalues women work in GDP calculations. Queer theory challenges how compulsory heterosexuality and binary sex-gender framework marginalize sexual minorities. These developments show how the struggle over meaning, identity and social structure remains alive in the 21st century. Now, let's come to historical development and theoretical foundations. Understanding these key concepts also requires tracing their intellectual histories. The sex-gender distinction emerged in feminist scholarship in the 1970s, seeking to separate biological fact from social meaning. Simone de Beauvoir's mid-20th century work laid the groundwork for gender as becoming rather than being. Later, feminist sociology and anthropology highlighted the role of culture and socialization, which produced gender difference. In parallel, queer theory and post-structuralism challenged fixed identity categories, arguing that gender and sexuality are fluid, relational, and performative. Patriarchy as a concept was reformulated by feminist theories such as Sylvia Walby in her identification of interlocking patriarchal structures. Similarly, masculinity studies were developed in the late 20th centuries to examine men's experiences and plurality of masculinities by Cornell and others. Similarly, femininity studies interrogated how feminine traits are valorized or devalued in gender systems, again by Cornell. Gender roles were studied by sociologists analyzing how socialization inculcates in behavioral expectations and how institutions reproduce gender division. Feminism itself has evolved through multiple waves, from suffrage to reproductive rights to intersectional and global feminist praxis. Each wave brought new emphasis like legal rights, cultural critiques, intersectionality, digital activism. All this resulted in a rich and complex scholarship that continuously revises its categories and methods. Analytical reflections. Power, identity and culture. At its heart, gender studies examine how power, identity and culture intertwine. The binary categories of male, female, man, women, heterosexual versus homosexual are not merely descriptive, they are normative. They organize how societies allocate resources, assign prestige, enforce discipline, and shape subjectivity. And when we speak of patriarchy, we address not only male dominance, but the systemic nature of gendered power. Feminism interrogates this very structure. Masculinity, femininity describe the ideals and performances that uphold or resist it, and gender roles specify how these ideals are operationalized. The cultural dimension is also very vital. What counts as masculine or feminine varies across time and place. Colonialism, globalization, migration, digital media all shape gender systems. For instance, the vernacular of masculinity in one society may emphasize on collective communal leadership, while in another it may emphasize on individual competition and aggression. The femininity ideal may emphasize modesty and domesticity in one cultural context, autonomy and public achievement in another. Gender roles adapt accordingly. Identity is also central. Individuals negotiate gendered expectations, sometimes confirming, sometimes resisting. The tension between structure and agency is ever present. Are individuals simply subject to gendered norms, or can they transform them? Feminist and queer theorists lean towards the latter. Gender is lived and contested, not fixed. Power underlies all of this. Who defines what counts as masculine or feminine? Who gets to appropriate the status of man or woman? Which bodies are legible? Which remain marginalized or invisible? Intersectionality reminds us that gender cannot be isolated from race, class, sexuality, ability, religion, and nationality. A working class man of color experiences masculinity differently than a middle class white man. A queer woman confronts femininity differently than a heterosexual woman. Some scholars argue that the tripartite distinction can oversimplify lived experiences by maintaining binaries. Queer theorists question if gender itself should be retained as a category or framed entirely in terms of performativity and fluidity. Others emphasize that sex itself is not free of social meanings. The scientific discourse around chromosomes and hormones is socially embedded. Patriarchy as a concept has also been critiqued for its tendency to privilege gender at the expense of class, race and other power axes, or for assuming a universal male dominance which may not map neatly in matrilineal or indigenous societies. Intersectional scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw insist that gender cannot be disentangled from other systems of oppression. In masculinity studies, critics warns of reinforcing the man-women binary by focusing too heavily on men's experience. Femininity studies face similar issues by emphasizing feminine traits. They may inadvertently reproduce gender existentialism if not being careful. Gender roles research must account for change, contestation, and transgression as well as persistence. In contemporary times, trans and non-binary identities challenge the male-female, man-women binaries directly. Gender studies must therefore evolve to incorporate more complex understandings of gender identity, expression, and bodies beyond Western-centric frameworks. New research with digital methods, for example, linguistic analysis of word embedding showing gender bias in language, reveal how gendered ideology persists subtly in language, culture, and technology. Cultural specificity matters. This is, as in Indian context, for instance, have historically different configurations of gender, sex, and sexuality. For example, we have hijra identities or third gender traditions other than Western countries. Incorporating these pluralities strengthens gender studies as a truly global discipline. Defining gender, sex, and sexuality requires moving beyond simplistic binaries to appreciate their complexity and interrelation. Sex is not merely biological but mediated through cultural interpretation. Gender is socially constructed, performed, and relational. Sexuality is again both personal and political, structured by power and discourse. Key concepts which we discussed, such as patriarchy, feminism, masculinity, femininity, and gender roles, provide us with critical frameworks for analyzing how societies distribute power and regulate identities. These concepts reveal that what is often perceived as natural is in fact historically contingent and politically contested. In the 21st century, grappling with these issues is not only a scholarly endeavor but a political necessity. As movements for gender justice expand globally, as digital platforms reveal new masculinities and feminities, as sexual and gender diversity gains recognition, the task of redefining and reimagining gender, sex, and sexuality continues. For students, researchers, and practitioners in journalism and mass communication, English literature, management, culture, and language assessment, this foundational studies clarifies more nuanced understanding and analysis of texts, contexts, and identities. This week 1 serves therefore as an indispensable entry point by clarifying key concepts and their genealogies while equipping you all to navigate more complex intersections of migration, colonialism, trade, culture, and identity that will follow in the later modules. The journey into gender studies is an invitation to question the given, scrutinize power, and imagine more inclusive futures. This week 1 course have citations from Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, Feminism and Subversion of Identity, and also Kaliskan's Gender Bias in Word Embeddings, a comprehensive analysis of frequency, syntax, and semantics. Cornell's Masculinities, Kimberly Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. Also, we have cited from Simone D. Beauvoir's Second Sex by H.M. Parsley, Vintage Books, Frosto Sterling Anna's Sexing the Body, Gender Politics and Construction of Sexuality. Some of the basic books used for this week 1 are from Michael Foucault's The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Bell Hooks' Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, some notes from Indira Gandhi National Open University, Understanding Gender-Related Concepts. Oh, sorry. First in ಹೇಳಬೇಕು ಅಂತ.
ಇಲ್ಲ ಇಂತ ತಡಿ ಮ್ಯಾಮ್.
ಬೇಸಿಕ್ ಬುಕ್ಸ್ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ ಸರ್.
ಅಲ್ಲ ಓಕೆ. ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ.
Some of the basic books used in the week 1 are Michael Foucault's The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center by Bell Hooks, and Gender Equality, Feminist Theories and Politics by Judith Lorber, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence by Andrienne Rich, Theorizing Patriarchy by Basil Backwell. These are some of the books. Besides, I have also used some points from Understanding Gender-Related Concepts Unit 1 by Indira Gandhi National Open University's notes. Thanking you. All the best.